What's up guys, it's Boondocks, and today I want to talk about the curious case of Maiming Strike, or more specifically, the nerfs in Warframe and the community reaction to them, as well as their general calls to reform. I'm going to be talking about two frames and two weapons that have been nerfed in the more recent history of Warframe, and I want to delve into why they were nerfed, as well as what it meant for the community at large. Just as a heads up, I'm not going to be talking about Saren, as she was actually more of a rework and not a straight up nerf. And I won't have any of the footage for any of the weapons or frames, how they used to work, mostly because all my old footage was deleted and I don't feel like searching on YouTube for new or old stuff, I guess. Anyways guys, let's jump into it. Let's start by talking about Valkyrie. The way that she was nerfed was probably one of the fairest possible methods. Her power wasn't directly decreased, however her requirements to use her proficiently were increased. So at the time, you would typically see trials and sorties always have a Valkyrie with them, because Valkyrie would be able to use her hysteria, becoming essentially unkillable because she would just ignore all damage. This meant that during those high damage missions, she could run around and constantly keep your teammates rezzed, and therefore never be able to fail the mission. However, the only downside was that she'd be stuck in melee. Of course, this didn't matter if you're essentially a res bot, not to mention she did a lot of melee damage. To counteract this, they nerfed her in two ways. For starters, they added a stacking damage debuff that was equal to 30% of the amount of damage you ignored while in Hysteria. When Hysteria ends, she now receives that damage equal to 25% of the buff, as long as there's an enemy within range. What this means is that if Valkyrie comes in contact with a Nullifier Bubble, a Scrambus, Ancient Disruptors, or any magnetic proc, while having a high debuff, she can be instantly killed. Or if you accidentally turn off your Hysteria while near those enemies. In addition, the energy drain now ramps up over time, so that the only way to keep your drain low is to intentionally drop out of Hysteria every so often. This means you have to play around the debuff, making sure that when your Hysteria gets too expensive, you run away, turn it off without having your debuff kill you, and then go back into Hysteria. So why was she nerfed? Well, Valkyrie is relatively easy to unlock, considering you only have to get to Jupiter, and has a low build requirements with regards to materials. This meant that new players could easily gain access to her and essentially coast through the remainder of the game, because at the time all you needed was a flow and a streamline to permanently stay in Hysteria. By adding the debuff as well as the energy drain, players now need to play around it. They need to know when to drop that buff, and also what enemies to avoid in order to stay safe. You need to adapt and learn, or pick a new frame. And because of that, her meta fell off. The far larger frame nerf comes in the form of Trinity's Blessing, and this nerf was completely understandable. Blessing was essentially broken, being able to completely heal up both health and shields of all teammates, regardless of where they were on the map. Combine that with a map-wide damage reduction, which used to scale up to 99%, it's pretty obvious why she was completely overpowered. The damage reduction was actually based off of whatever teammate was healed the most, or from the least amount of health. So the old meta used to be that everyone would just bring a quick thinking, so that when they hit 1 health, they would lose energy instead of taking fatal damage. Trinity would then heal the entire team to full, and since one teammate had no health, the team would receive 99% damage reduction, which would last for about half a minute. Trinity would then restore all that energy lost using Energy Vampire, and everything would be good. Rinse and repeat. And again, I want to say that this was map-wide, meaning that even if your team was completely spread out in, say, a void survival mission, it didn't matter, everyone was completely safe. So how was she nerfed? Well, for starters, the range of Blessing was reduced to affinity range. This means that the range was reduced down to 50-meter radius, which is still pretty ridiculous when you think about it. Combine that with the fact that the max damage reduction is now maxed out at 75%, and Trinity was substantially nerfed. However, as everyone knows, Trinity is still considered the best healer, and has the Energy Vampire to make her even more crazy. So while the nerf was powerful, it didn't do much to slow down Trinity's use. So why exactly was she nerfed? Well, she was extremely powerful, and it made it so that the other healers in the game were just never used. Frames like Oberon and Equinox were never used to fill the healer position, since the heals were weaker, conditional, and didn't have to ability to bring that damage reduction like Blessing. Because of that, groups going on trials would ignore you if you wanted to bring an Equinox, and instead make you bring a Trinity. The community always asked for the other healers to be buffed so that they could bring them instead of bringing the Trinity all the damn time. So DE tried nerfing the overpowered Trinity instead of buffing the other frames, but it wasn't enough to dethrone the support queen. As far as weapons that were nerfed, I'm going to start with the Tonkor. For those that don't remember or weren't around for the pre-nerf Tonkor meta, let me explain. The Tonkor is a grenade launcher that deals 325 blast damage as base, with a 25% crit chance and a 2.5 times crit multiplier. So that means that it was possible to get some insane crit damage explosions that had giant AoE, which could also be increased with Firestorm. This meant that entire waves of enemies could often be insta-killed thanks to the Tonkor. And did I mention that it had a fast fire rate and reload speed? The only downside was that the grenades fired in an arc and would only explode on contact with it whenever it hit an enemy or after a 3-second countdown. Until then, if it hit a wall or an environmental object, it would bounce all over the place with no way to manually detonate it. Now, having grenades that bounce all over the place can be dangerous. What if you hit yourself? Well, it used to not matter. The grenades only did 50 total damage, regardless of how you actually modded the weapon. So you could even do really cool grenade jumps if the situation lined up properly. Then came along the nerf bat. The grenades now do full damage to the player, usually killing them instantly, considering they're going to crit and typically hit for something like 12,000 damage minimum. Due to the often unwieldy bounces of the grenades that the Tonkor takes, it's almost never seen anymore outside of those diehard fans that want to really hold on to that memory. Oh, the Telus Boltas, the founder of the Maiming Strike meta. So, if you weren't around at the release of the Syndicate melee weapons, this might sound a little bit odd to you. But the Telus Boltas was actually the best weapon in the game. The reason being is that the Telus Boltas has the second highest slide damage, and is only trailing behind the Ohm. Now, slide attacks can sometimes be a little unwieldy to land, but the old Bolas had a very unique and powerful passive. Every time you used a slide attack, energy waves would radiate out, hitting all surrounding enemies. This would not only do your insane amount of slide damage, but also apply a slash proc. The range of the energy wave could also be increased using reach or primed reach. And since the waves would penetrate through all walls or environmental objects, all containers and enemies would just die before you. It wasn't uncommon to go into a mission and see all 4 players with the Telus Boltas, or players with a 1-button macro that would have a frame-perfect spam of the slide attack. Other weapons and frames quickly became irrelevant as the Boltas meta ran rampant. Naturally, DE had to nerf it, so they replaced the passive with a new one that the energy wave, instead of having a slash ability, now vacuums in all enemies on your first slide attack, and then ragdolls them on your second. This effect also has a cooldown. So because of that, the Telus Boltas has faded into obscurity. It's just another Syndicate mastery fodder weapon. The Telus Boltas had another huge effect on the meta. Before its release, people didn't even pay attention to Maiming Strike. It is weird how under the radar it was. Many people saw it as a throwaway Acolyte mod, while the focus was on mods like Blood Rush, Argon Scope, and Bladed Rounds. Maiming Strike was all but forgotten about. Then the Telus Boltas was released, and right away Maiming Strike rose through the ranks. With the death of the Boltas, the desire to continue using Maiming Strike lived on. So people began sticking in on everything. Ohm, since it had such high slide damage, Orthos and Orthos Prime, since they had such crazy range, and the mainstay, Atarax, thanks to its high crit damage and long range. So, why is Maiming Strike so powerful? It ignores weapon crit chance completely and sets it to 90% flat. This means that you're extremely likely to achieve a crit whenever you use a slide attack, regardless of what the weapon's crit chance is. Essentially, your weapon could become a crit machine, and weapons such as the Atarax now have a 90% chance to crit, combined with high stat chance and crit damage. It just melts faces. With the elimination of the Narrowmon Shadow Step, weapons that are based off crit are no longer compared to their normal stats, and instead are evaluated based on how well they work with Maiming Strike. Now it's time to discuss the curious case of Maiming Strike and how the community actually wants some nerfs. Mods are very rarely nerfed, with Coolant Leak being one of the few examples. And the nerfs I've already discussed so far came because they were meta-defining and DE nerfed them to balance the games. Two things which you can argue need to be done with Maiming Strike. There is one major difference, however, between the nerfs I've talked about and Maiming Strike: availability. This availability has two main effects. First, what the community thinks, and second, what DE could do. As far as the community is concerned, a large percent couldn't care less if Maiming Strike is nerfed, and this is because they can't use it. Maiming Strike was an Acolyte-only drop, which, due to the underrated nature that I talked about before, it wasn't as heavily farmed for as, say, Argon Scope. Because of this, there are very few mods by comparison in circulation, causing the price of Maiming Strike to raise about 800 plat. Because of this, not everyone gets to play with the mod, so out of indifference or possibly even jealousy, they don't care if it's nerfed, and some people even ask for it to be nerfed. This is a departure from what the community normally asks for, since they typically ask for buffs, and then have indirect nerfs in order to level the playing field. With regards to DE, they have some hard work if they decide to nerf Maiming. So far, when frames are nerfed, nothing happens for the player. I feel like this is because players typically just want the frames, caring less about the power and more about how they're played as a variation of the other frames, and how they look. Fashion frame, the true endgame. When weapons are nerfed, however, players are often refunded the forma that they invest into them. Such was the case with the Tonkor and the Telus Boltas. The major thing here is, how do you refund a mod? Imagine, if you will, that you were a player who farmed 800 plat, or even paid DE directly to get 800 plat, specifically to buy Maiming Strike. Then, the next week, the next day, the next hour, DE changes Maiming Strike so that it's just a crit modifier, or multiplier, instead of a flat 90%. This would be a huge nerf, and you as a player would have essentially spent 800 plat for a now nearly worthless mod. You would be pissed and probably want to quit playing. How would DE ever refund you? The answer is they can't. So, with the curious case of Maiming Strike, I don't think you can ever actually nerf it until the market becomes oversaturated. The way that the market could become saturated with Maiming Strike is the same way that it became saturated with Blood Rush. If you didn't know, Blood Rush used to cost about 150 to 200 plat. Now it costs all of about 25 plat. This is because it was added to the Lua Spy loot table when Lua Spy was introduced. So by adding Maiming Strike to a new interesting mission, let's say a Kuva Fortress, insert cool thing here, or maybe even the bounty rewards, though bounties are getting a little boring at this point, the market could eventually become saturated as people go and hard farm Maiming Strike. The other option is to bring back the Acolytes, which to be honest is highly likely. Eventually, there'll be so many Maiming Strikes to saturate the market that the overall price will drop down to about 50 plat. So, once the price is down to about 50 plat, and then a nerf comes out, people will still be angry, but not quit the game altogether levels of anger. Personally, I like Maiming Strike, and I wish more people had the chance to use it. More so, even for new players, considering the Atarax is such a low MR weapon. With Condition Overload quickly becoming the new meta, there's even less reason to look at Maiming Strike as requiring of a nerf. I feel like the melee weapons are more diverse now than they have been in a long time, especially when you look at what the meta was, purely crit, not too long ago. I hope the curious case of Maiming Strike will stick around and act as a sort of sign for future content to not only be careful with releasing overpowered mods and weapons, but also as a reminder that you shouldn't underrate weapons or mods until you've actually tried them out. Anyways, it's been a long one, so until next time, like, comment, and subscribe. Good luck, have fun, and peace.